I am 74 years old. I have lived a lot. I have seen things no human being should ever see. But I have also experienced miracles that only God can perform. Today I want to tell you my story. A story that for many years I kept hidden, deep in my heart. But now, in the twilight of my life, I feel I must share it with you and the world. My name is Sarah Evans. I was born in London in 1950, when England was still recovering from the war. It was a difficult time, where families struggled to survive and children knew hunger from a very young age. My parents, John and Mary, married very young, full of dreams and hopes. But life showed them that love is not always enough when there isn't money to put food on the table. I remember when I was just 6 years old, we lived in a small apartment in the East End, one of the humblest neighborhoods in London. It was 1956, and my parents worked from dawn till dusk to pay our rent of £7 a month. My father was a bricklayer, my mother a seamstress, and despite their efforts, there was never enough money. There were 3 of us siblings, me, who was the middle child, my older brother Tom, and my younger brother Harry. Everything began to fall apart when my parents decided to separate. Son, you cannot imagine the pain a 6-year-old girl feels when she sees her family breaking apart before her eyes. My father packed his few belongings in a cardboard suitcase and left home. My mother was left with the 3 of us, crying every night, wondering how she would manage on her own. During the first few months after the divorce, we lived one day with Dad and one with Mum. It was a terrible situation for us children because we never knew where we would wake up the next day. I remember perfectly when my mother asked us who we wanted to live with. With my childlike innocence, I told her, "Mum, I want Dad and Mum together. Why can't you be together like before?" But life isn't that simple, son. In the end, we stayed with Dad because he had a more stable job and could support us better. But when I turned 9, my father decided it was better for me to go live with Mum, because according to him, a girl needed to be with her mother, especially when she started to become a young lady. My mother had moved to an even poorer neighborhood, living in what we called a tenement, which were very small rooms where several families lived, sharing a common courtyard and a single bathroom. The room where my mother and I lived was no more than 4 square meters with a bed and a small table where she sewed to earn a few shillings. Those were very hard months, son. There were days when we had nothing to eat, days when my mother would lie down with me crying, hugging me tight, whispering in my ear that everything would get better, that God would not abandon us. But at 9 years old, I didn't understand why God allowed us to suffer so much hardship. It was during that time of extreme poverty that we met Mrs. Eleanor Gray. She was a woman in her 40s, very elegant, always well-dressed, who owned a small beauty products company. My Aunt Susan worked at her house as a domestic helper, and one day she took my mother to meet her, thinking that perhaps Mrs. Gray could give my mother a job too. I remember perfectly the day I met Mrs. Gray. It was an April afternoon in 1960, very hot, and my mother had put on my only decent dress, a navy blue one that was already too small for me. Mrs. Gray arrived at the tenement in a shiny black car, something that was almost a miracle in our neighborhood. When she got out of the car, she looked like a film star. She wore an elegant pink dress, high heels, perfectly styled hair, and makeup like the rich ladies we saw in magazines. She looked at me with great tenderness and said, "Are you Sarah? What a beautiful girl." Then she turned to my mother. "Mary, this child is a treasure. Look at her beautiful eyes. What an angelic face." My mother blushed with pride, because even though we were poor, she always managed to keep me clean and well-groomed. Mrs. Gray started visiting us frequently. She always arrived with bags full of food, ham, cheese, freshly baked bread, fruits that we could not afford to buy. She also brought me gifts, a doll, children's books, sweets. I was fascinated by this kind lady who seemed to have come from heaven to save us. One day, after several months of these visits, Mrs. Gray made a proposal to my mother that would change my life forever. The three of us were sitting in our small room, drinking coffee that Mrs. Gray had brought, when she looked at my mother very seriously and said, "Mary, it pains me greatly to see how you are living. This child is very intelligent. She has a lot of potential, but here she will be ruined. I want to help you. Let me take Sarah to live with me. I will give her the best education. I will raise her as if she were my own daughter. I will enroll her in the best school in London. She will study languages, music. She will have everything a girl deserves." My mother remained silent for a long time, with tears in her eyes. I didn't understand very well what was happening, but I felt that something very important was being decided. Finally, my mother told Mrs. Gray, "It's a very difficult decision. Sarah is what I love most in this world, but if it's best for her." Mrs. Gray took my mother's hands in hers and said, "Mary, I promise you, on all that is sacred, that I will care for her like a daughter. She will never lack for anything. She will have the life you wish you could give her, but cannot. And you will be able to visit her whenever you want. She will still be your daughter, but with a secure future." I remember that night my mother hugged me very tightly and said, "My dear daughter, do you want to go live with Mrs. Gray? She will give you nice things. You will study at a girls' school. You will have a better life." I, having just turned 10, didn't really understand what it meant to leave home. But the idea of having new toys and going to a nice school excited me. A week later, Mrs. Gray came to pick me up in her black car. I carried a small suitcase with my few belongings: 2 dresses, underwear, my everyday shoes, and my Sunday shoes, and my favorite doll. My mother hugged me at the door of the tenement, crying, and said, "Be good, my dear. Be obedient. Study hard. And remember that Mummy loves you more than her own life." The journey to Mrs. Gray's house was like entering a dream. We left the poor neighborhood where I had always lived and drove up increasingly elegant streets until we reached a residential area that I didn't even know existed in London. Her house was a 2-story mansion with a beautiful garden full of flowers, a fountain in the center, and shady trees. When we entered, I couldn't believe my eyes. Persian carpets, shiny wooden furniture, paintings on the walls, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Mrs. Gray took me to what would be my room. It was larger than the entire room where I had lived with my mother. It had a 4-poster bed, a huge wardrobe, a desk for studying, and shelves full of books. The walls were painted pink, and there were white lace curtains. It was like a princess's room from a fairy tale. The first 6 months at Mrs. Gray's house were the happiest of my life until then. The day after I arrived, she took me shopping in central London. We went to the most elegant stores and she bought me beautiful clothes, dresses, shoes, coats, silk underwear, even a fur coat for the winter. Afterwards, we went to a very elegant hair salon where they cut my hair and gave me a beautiful hairstyle. She also kept her promise to enroll me in the best school. She enrolled me in St. Margaret's School, where the daughters of London's richest families studied. I, who had gone to a public school, where we didn't even have enough books, suddenly found myself in classrooms with only 15 students, where the nuns taught us French, piano, good manners, and, of course, all academic subjects. During those first few months, Mrs. Gray truly treated me like a daughter. She took me for walks in Hyde Park, We went to the cinema on Sundays. We ate in elegant restaurants. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world. And best of all, every 2 weeks, Mrs. Gray would take me to visit my mother. I always arrived very well dressed, with new dresses, my hair nicely done, and my mother was filled with joy to see me so. Well cared for. Several people lived in Mrs. Gray's house. There was her husband, Mr. Arthur, who was an engineer and traveled a lot for work, so I only saw him on weekends. She had 2 older children, David and Eleanor Jr., who were already studying at university and were hardly ever home. Her adoptive mother, Mrs. Davies, also lived there, an elderly lady who had started to have memory problems and spent almost the entire day in her room. And there was Brenda, the domestic helper who had replaced my Aunt Susan. Everything was perfect or so, I thought. But my son, life would soon teach me that not all that glitters is gold, and that sometimes the most charming people on the outside can hide the darkest hearts on the inside. The first sign that something was changing was when Mrs. Gray started scolding me for very small things. If I left a book out of place, if I didn't finish all the food on my plate, if I made any noise after 8 in the evening. At first, I thought it was normal, that since I came from a very different environment, I had to learn the rules of an elegant house. But the scoldings became more frequent and more severe. One day, I came home from school with a note from the nun because I had talked during math class. When I showed the note to Mrs. Gray, I saw her face transform in a way I had never seen before. It was as if a mask had fallen from her face, and for the first time I saw the real Eleanor Gray. "How dare you cause me problems at school?" she yelled at me, grabbing my arm with a force that hurt me. "Do you know how much money I'm spending on your education? Do you know what your mother would do to me if she knew you were behaving like a savage?" That night, for the first time since I arrived at her house, she sent me to bed without dinner. I didn't understand what I had done so wrong to deserve such punishment, but I obeyed without protesting, thinking that the next day everything would go back to how it was before. But things didn't go back to how they were before, son. It was as if Mrs. Gray had been acting for 6 months, and now she could finally show her true personality. The scoldings turned into shouts, the shouts turned into threats, and the threats, well, very soon they turned into something much worse. The moment that marked the end of my childhood forever was one afternoon in November 1960. I had come home from school with my report card, and in writing class I had gotten a 0 because I hadn't properly understood what the nun had asked us to write. When I showed the report card to Mrs. Gray, I felt for the first time in my life what pure terror was. She stared at that grade for what seemed like an eternity, and then, very slowly, she looked up at me. Her eyes had completely changed. They looked like the eyes of a different person, of someone capable of any evil. "A 0, she said to me in a voice I had never heard before, a voice cold as ice. "Do you know how much that school's monthly fee costs? Do you know how much money I'm throwing away on you?" I started to tremble without understanding why. I sensed that something terrible was about to happen, but my 10-year-old mind couldn't imagine what was coming. "Go to the bathroom in my room," she ordered me, "and wait for me there on your knees." I obeyed without daring to ask anything. I went to her bathroom, which was larger than the room where I had lived with my mother, and knelt on the cold marble floor. I waited there, trembling, for what seemed like an eternity, until I heard her heels approaching down the hallway. When she entered the bathroom, she was holding a red leather belt in her hand, a thick belt with several metal buckles that gleamed under the light. Never in my life had I seen such a cold expression on a human being's face. "This will hurt you more than me," she said. But you have to learn that mediocrity is not tolerated in this house. Your mother entrusted your education to me, and I will not allow you to disappoint her." What happened next was the beginning of a hell that would last almost 2 years. Mrs. Gray beat me with that belt until the buckles began to detach from the leather. She hit me on the back, on my legs, on my arms, while I screamed and begged her to stop. But every time I screamed, she hit harder. "In this house, we don't cry," she would say while hitting me. "Well-behaved girls don't make noise when they are being corrected." When she finally stopped, my entire body was marked with the imprints of the belt buckles. My back burned as if fire had been poured on it, and I could barely move from the pain. "Now go to your room," she said as if nothing had happened. "And I don't want to hear you cry. If I hear a single whimper, I'll come back and double it." That night I couldn't sleep, not only because of the physical pain, which was horrible, but because of the mental confusion. I didn't understand how the woman who for 6 months had treated me like a princess had suddenly turned into this monster. I thought maybe it was my fault, that perhaps I truly deserved that punishment for getting a bad grade. But my son, that first beating was just the beginning. From that day on, Mrs. Gray developed an entire system of tortures that she applied to me every time she felt frustrated, every time she had problems at work, every time her husband didn't come home, every time anything didn't go her way. She created what she called my reflection point, which was a small room in the service area of the house, where she would take me every night around midnight for her correction sessions. It was a place isolated from the rest of the house, where no one could hear my screams, where no one could interrupt what she was doing to me. She had an entire ritual for these tortures. She always waited until everyone in the house was asleep. Then she would come to my room, wake me up and say, "Sarah, it's time to go to your point." Those 5 words became the most terrifying I could hear. In that room, there were things a 10-year-old girl shouldn't know. Ropes, chains, instruments, whose purpose I didn't know but would soon learn to fear. She also had a notebook where she meticulously recorded every punishment she gave me, as if it were a scientific experiment. The tortures were varied and crueler each day. She would hang me by my wrists on a service staircase, sometimes for hours until I completely lost feeling in my arms. She would burn my skin with a hot iron, drawing shapes on my back and legs. She would cut small pieces of my tongue with small scissors, telling me that this way I would learn not to speak when I shouldn't. One of her favorite tortures was crushing my fingers one by one in the frame of a wooden door. She would place my finger in the frame, close the door with all her strength, and force me to count to 10 before opening it. If I cried, she would put the next finger. This continued until I had no nails left, until my fingers were so swollen that I couldn't write at school. She forced me to eat her dog's excrement, telling me that this was my food until I learned to behave like a lady. She would leave me without food for 3 days, and when she finally gave me food, it was spoiled leftovers she kept in a dirty container. When I was thirsty, she wouldn't let me drink water. I was so desperate that I even drank my own urine, hidden in the bathroom, when she wasn't looking. She would plunge my head into a tank full of water until I almost drowned, pull me out when I couldn't take it anymore, and then repeat after it. She would sprinkle pepper powder in my eyes, nose and ears, until it burned inside me like fire. But of all the tortures she inflicted on me, there is one I will never forget, and that almost killed me. One day, I no longer remember why, she told me she was going to teach me a lesson I would never forget. She took me to the punishment room and started hitting my head with a wooden stick. "Count," she said. "Count every blow, so you know how many you deserve. 1, 2, 3. I counted as she hit my head with terrible force. 10, 20, 30. My head started to swell, to bleed, but she didn't stop. 40, 50, 60. I lost count because I couldn't think clearly anymore, but she continued. When she finally stopped, she had counted 70 blows to my head, 60 to the back of my neck, and 7 to my stomach. My head was so swollen, it looked like a melon. My eyes were bruised and almost closed. My nose was twisted. My mouth couldn't open properly. My hair fell out in handfuls every time I touched it. That time she did take me to the hospital, but first she threatened me in a way that paralyzed me with terror. If you tell anyone what happened, I will kill your mother, your father, and your brothers. I have money and power. I can make them disappear, and no one will ever find them. And I will torture you every day until you die begging me to kill you at once. At the hospital, the doctor immediately suspected something was wrong. He asked Mrs. Gray to leave the consultation room and asked me directly, "Child, who did this? To you? Did they hit you? You can trust me. No one will harm you." I had the opportunity of my life to be free, to be saved, for my suffering to end. But Mrs. Gray's threats echoed in my head like drums. I couldn't risk my family's lives. With my head bowed and crying, I told the doctor, "Doctor, I fell down the stairs." He looked at me sadly, knowing I was lying, but unable to do anything. Mrs. Gray came back in. The doctor prescribed medicine for the pain and bandages for the wounds, and we left the hospital. In the car, on our way back, Mrs. Gray tore up all the medical prescriptions and threw them out the window. "When do you think I'm going to spend my money on medicine for you?" she said, laughing. "Your medicine is the dog's leftovers." And indeed, when we got home, she forced me to eat her dog's excrement, telling me that was the medicine I deserved. I was so sore, so desperate, that I ate what she gave me without protesting. During all this time, there was one thing that kept a thread of hope alive in me, though Mrs. Gray didn't know it. After each torture session, after beating and torturing me, she would take me to a final punishment that she considered the worst: humiliation. She would force me to stand in front of the service bathroom door and read the Bible aloud for hours. "Take this cursed book," she would say, handing me a black Bible, "and read it aloud. If I pass by here and don't hear you reading, you will know a pain you can't even imagine." She thought she was punishing me, humiliating me. But without knowing it, she was giving me the most powerful weapon that exists against evil: the Word of God. As I read those verses, standing there with my whole body aching, I began to know a God who loved me, who had sent his son Jesus to die for me, who had a plan for my life that included freeing me from that hell. I read about Daniel in the lion's den, about the 3 young men in the fiery furnace, about Job and all his misfortunes, but also about how God delivered them all. I read about Jesus, who also suffered terrible tortures, but who rose on the 3rd day. And I began to believe that if God could do those miracles, he could also get me out of where I was. I learned to pray during those long hours standing in front of the bathroom. At first, they were timid prayers, barely audible whispers. But little by little, they became long conversations with God, where I told him all my suffering, where I asked him to give me strength to endure one more day, where I begged him to one day take me out of that place. At school, the nuns began to notice that something strange was happening to me. I would arrive with bandages on my fingers, with bruises on my arms, always tired. Sometimes I would fall asleep in class. But when they asked me what was wrong, I repeated the same story Mrs. Gray had taught me, that I was very clumsy, that I fell a lot, that I tripped over things. One of the nuns, Sister Mary, approached me one day after classes and said, "Sarah, if you ever need help, if something is happening to you at home, you can trust me. God has placed me in your path to care for you." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. But then I remembered Mrs. Gray's threats and fear paralyzed me again. I smiled at the nun and said, "Thank you, Sister Mary, but I'm fine. Mrs. Gray takes very good care of me." The months continued to pass, and I continued living this double life. During the day, I was the well-behaved girl from St. Margaret's School, and during the nights, I was the victim of tortures that would have made medieval inquisitors pale. There were times when I thought of escaping. Once I reached the front door of the house with a small suitcase. But when I was about to leave, I thought about what Mrs. Gray would do to my family if I left, and I returned to my room. Another time, I tried to write a letter to my mother telling her everything, but Mrs. Gray checked my mail, so I tore up the letter before finishing it. The situation became even worse when Brenda, the domestic helper, became Mrs. Gray's accomplice. At first, I thought she would help me, because she had seen some of the tortures. But instead of reporting what was happening, she became part of the system. When Mrs. Gray told her, "Brenda, go and put pepper in Sarah's eyes," she would go and do it without protesting. When she said, "Chain her to the stairs," she would chain me. When she said, "Don't give her food for 3 days," she would deny me even a glass of water. I came to hate Brenda more than Mrs. Gray herself, because she had the freedom to leave the house. She had access to the outside world. She could have called the police or told someone what was happening. But she chose to be an accomplice to evil out of cowardice or convenience. Visits to my mother became less and less frequent. Mrs. Gray only took me when I didn't have very visible marks, and she always prepared me beforehand. "If your mother notices anything strange if you say a single word about what happens here, that will be the last time you see her alive." My poor mother, every time she saw me, she would tell me how beautiful I looked, how well Mrs. Gray was taking care of me, how proud she was to see me becoming an educated young lady. If she had known that her daughter was living in hell in that elegant house, she would have died of grief. The worst moment of all came one morning in March 1962. I was 12 years old. I had been enduring these tortures for almost 2 years, and that night Mrs. Gray was especially furious because she had had problems in her business. She came to my room around 2 in the morning. "Sarah, let's go to the point," she said with that cold voice I knew so well. But this time it was different. In her eyes there was a madness I hadn't seen before, as if she had completely lost her mind. She took me to the punishment room and chained me to the service stairs as she had done so many times before. But then she put a dirty rag in my mouth and secured it with adhesive tape so I couldn't scream. "This time," she said, "you're going to stay here until you learn to be truly obedient. I'm tired of your rebellion. I'm tired of having to correct you every day." Before leaving, she sprayed the rag in my mouth with liquid pepper. The burning sensation was so intense that I felt as if I were burning from the inside. My eyes streamed continuously. My nose burned. I felt like I was suffocating. It was 2 in the morning when she left me there, hanging by my wrists. With my arms raised, I could barely touch the floor with the tips of my toes. At first, I tried to find a position that would hurt less, but there was none. The weight of my body hanging from my wrists was unbearable. Hours passed. 3 in the morning, 4, 5. My arms had lost all sensation. I no longer felt them as part of my body. The pepper in my mouth was driving me crazy with pain. When the sun rose, around 6 in the morning, I no longer had the strength to even cry. I had lost hope that anyone would come to help me. Mrs. Gray had gone to work as if nothing had happened, leaving me hanging there like an animal. The morning hours continued to pass. 7, 8, 9. I drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, but then I realized it was my mind no longer functioning properly. The pain had reached a point where it was no longer pain. It was as if my body had decided to disconnect to protect me. At 10:22 in the morning on March 15th, 1962, my son, something happened that even today, after more than 60 years, makes me cry with emotion when I remember it. Hanging from those stairs without strength, without hope, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. A desperate prayer, the last prayer of a girl who couldn't take it anymore. In my mind, because I couldn't speak with the rag in my mouth, I said to God, "Heavenly Father, I can't take it anymore. I don't understand why this is happening to me. I don't understand what I did wrong to deserve so much suffering. If you really exist, if you really love me as the Bible says, get me out of here. But if you can't get me out, then let me die now, because I don't have the strength to bear another day." It was a prayer of total surrender, son. I no longer asked God to improve my situation. I asked him to end my suffering in any way possible. I closed my eyes after that prayer, feeling a strange peace, as if I had placed all my burden in the hands of someone more powerful than myself. Do you know what happened 3 minutes after that prayer? At precisely 10:25, I heard a sound that changed my life forever. The front door of the house burst open, and a woman's voice shouted, "Police! Is anyone in this house?" At first, I thought I was hallucinating, that my mind had reached its limit and now I was making things up. But then I heard footsteps running through the house, men's and women's voices, and someone shouted, "Here! There's a girl chained here!" A female police officer rushed into the room where I was. When she saw me hanging from those stairs, chained and gagged, she put her hands to her face and cried out, "My God! Holy Virgin! What have they done to this child?" Immediately, more police officers came. Very carefully, they lowered me from the stairs, removed my chains, took the rag out of my mouth. I could no longer move my arms. I felt nothing from my shoulders down. The female police officer, whose name was Jane, hugged me very tenderly and whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, child. It's all over now. No one will ever hurt you again. It was God who sent us here to save you." When I heard those words, "It was God who sent us here," I immediately remembered the prayer I had made just 3 minutes earlier. 3 minutes, my son. Between my desperate prayer and the arrival of my salvation, exactly 3 minutes had passed. If that's not a miracle from God, then miracles don't exist. I started to cry, but no longer from pain, but from relief, from gratitude, from the absolute certainty that God had heard my cry for help. Through sobs, I told the police officer, "Madam, I asked God to save me. I asked 3 minutes ago, and you arrived. God exists. God heard me." Jane had tears in her eyes. She hugged me tighter and said, "Yes, child, God exists, and He loves you very much. We are His instruments to get you out of this hell." As they took me out of the house, they explained how they had gotten there. A neighbor of the house, a lawyer named Mr. Davies, had noticed that for months he hadn't seen me go to school. Since he left for work very early, he had always seen me walk to the school bus stop, but suddenly he stopped seeing me. At first, he thought that perhaps we had changed our schedule, or that I was being driven. But when more time passed and he didn't see me, he began to worry. He asked Brenda, the housekeeper, where the girl who lived in the house was. She always made up excuses. That I was sick, that I had traveled with the family, that I was on vacation. But Mr. Davies was a lawyer. He had experience dealing with liars, and he realized that something was not right. Finally, he told Brenda, "Look, madam, if you don't tell me where that child is right now, I'm going to call the police. A minor cannot just disappear like that." Brenda, scared, confessed, "The child is being punished upstairs, on the service stairs." Immediately, Mr. Davies called the authorities, and that's why they came to rescue me, exactly when I needed them most. Years later, when I was an adult woman, I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Davies. I asked him what had motivated him to insist so much, what had made him suspect that something bad was happening. His answer confirmed once again that God had orchestrated my rescue. "Sarah," he told me, "I don't know how to explain it to you, but something inside me wouldn't leave me alone. It was as if an inner voice told me, 'That child is in danger. You have to do something.' I couldn't sleep at night thinking about you. God was using me to save you, even though I didn't understand it at the time." The police officers photographed and documented everything they found in the house. The chains, the torture instruments, the notebook, where Mrs. Gray recorded every punishment she gave me. When the detectives arrived, they couldn't believe the systematic cruelty of what they had discovered. Meanwhile, they took me to St. Thomas's Hospital. The doctors who examined me were horrified to see the state of my body. I had burn marks all over my back and legs, my fingers deformed from the times they had been crushed, pieces of my tongue that had been cut, scars everywhere. But what most impressed the doctors was my mental state. Despite everything I had suffered, I was not psychologically broken. I had a serenity, an inner peace that they couldn't explain. I knew why. It was the faith I had developed reading the Bible during my punishments. It was the presence of God I had felt in my darkest moments. The doctor who treated me, Dr. Thompson, told me years later, "Sarah, in all my years of medicine, I had never seen a torture victim with such inner peace. It was as if something supernatural had protected you from completely breaking down." When Mrs. Gray was arrested, she arrived from work suspecting nothing. The police officers were waiting for her at the door of her house. Upon seeing the official, Cars, she immediately knew that everything was over. But even as she was being arrested, she kept trying to manipulate the situation. She told the officers, "Sirs, this is a misunderstanding. That child is very rebellious, very deceitful. I was just trying to educate her, to make her a decent young lady." One of the police officers, an older man who had granddaughters my age, couldn't contain himself. He shouted, "Madam, you are a monster! How can you call torturing a defenseless creature education?" Brenda was also arrested as an accomplice. She cried and apologized, saying she was afraid of Mrs. Gray, that she feared losing her job. But her fear did not justify being an accomplice to so much suffering. During the first few days in the hospital, I was in a state of shock. I couldn't believe that I was finally free, that no one was going to hurt me, that I could speak without fear of being punished. The nurses treated me with great tenderness, and little by little, I regained confidence in adults. My mother found out what had happened by watching the news on television. The case became famous throughout England because the cruelty of the tortures was something people couldn't imagine happening in a respectable family home. When my mother arrived at the hospital, she threw herself on my bed, crying and apologizing again and again. "My dear daughter, forgive me. I only wanted the best for you. I only wanted you to have a better future." I hugged her and said, "Mom, you are not to blame for anything. You gave me to that woman because you loved me, because you wanted me to have opportunities you couldn't give me. Love is never guilty of the evil others do." During the trial, which lasted several months, it was discovered that I was not the first child Mrs. Gray had tortured. There had been 5 girls in total over the years, all from poor families, all handed over by parents who believed they were giving them a better opportunity. The other 4 families testified at the trial. It was heartbreaking to hear stories similar to mine, to see other parents who had also been deceived by that devilish woman. Mrs. Gray was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but due to good behavior, she was released in 7. Brenda received 8 years and served 3. For me, those sentences were insufficient, but I understood that human justice has its limits, and that true justice would come from God. After the trial, the authorities took me to a children's home while they decided what to do with me. My parents had lost legal custody for allowing an irregular adoption. It was a very complicated legal situation. It was in that home where I met the people who would change my life forever. Pastors Robert and Grace Miller. They ran a Christian foundation in London dedicated to helping traumatized children, and when they learned about my case, they offered to adopt me. The first day I met them, I felt something special about them. They had a peace, a genuine kindness that was noticeable from the very first moment. They didn't try to impress me with gifts or promises. They simply offered me their sincere love. "Sarah," Pastor Robert told me, "we don't promise you riches or luxuries. We only promise you love, understanding, and the opportunity to heal completely from all you have suffered." I, who was already 12 years old and had learned to distrust adults, told them, "Sir, how do I know that you won't harm me like Mrs. Gray did?" Pastor Grace approached me, knelt down to my height, looked me in the eyes and said, "Daughter, you don't have to trust us immediately. Trust is earned with time and actions. We only ask that you give us the opportunity to show you that there are good adults in this world." During the first few months living with Pastors Robert and Grace in London, I was constantly on alert, waiting for them to take off their mask at any moment and show me their true face. But that never happened. On the contrary, every day that passed, they showed me more love and patience. When I had nightmares at night, Pastor Grace would come to my room, sit on my bed, and sing Christian songs to me until I fell back asleep. When I became aggressive or rebellious, which happened often because I didn't know how to process so much trauma, Pastor Robert never yelled at me or punished me. He would just say, "Sarah, I understand you're angry. You have a right to be angry about everything they did to you. But we're going to find healthy ways to express that rage." Little by little, through much love, much patience, and much prayer, I began to heal. The pastors took me to Christian psychologists who helped me process the trauma. They also took me to their church, where I met a community of people who welcomed me as family. The most important thing they did for me was to teach me the true message of the gospel. I had read the Bible during my tortures, but now I truly understood what it meant that Jesus had died for me, what forgiveness meant, what it meant to have a personal relationship with God. One day, after living with them for 8 months, I told Pastor Grace, "Mom Grace, I want to be baptized. I want to surrender my life completely to Jesus." She cried with emotion and said, "Daughter, that is the most beautiful gift you can give to God and to us. To see how you have healed, how you have forgiven, how you have decided to love despite all you suffered, is a miracle from God." My baptism was the most beautiful day of my life until that moment. I had invited my mother, my brothers, the entire church congregation. When Pastor Robert immersed me in the water and lifted me up, symbolically burying the traumatized Sarah and resurrecting the free Sarah, I felt that I had finally been born again. I lived with Pastors Robert and Grace for 9 months in total. Pastor Grace always said that God had given her those 9 months to spiritually gestate me, to give birth to me as a new creature in Christ. When I turned 13, I made a decision that surprised everyone. I wanted to return to London with my father. The pastors supported me, although they knew they would miss me very much. They helped me get my father legal custody back, made sure he had the proper conditions to care for me, and kept constant contact with me. My return to London was like returning to life. My father had made a huge effort to meet all the requirements the judge set for him. He had bought an apartment, learned to drive to buy a car, and had gotten a more stable job. He was determined to make up for lost time with me. My brothers, who were already teenagers, welcomed me with great joy. They knew what had happened, because the case had been very public, but they never made me feel like a victim. They treated me like their beloved sister who had finally returned home. At 14, I began to feel something in my heart that I didn't expect, the desire to tell my story. At first, it was only in the church where I worshipped, telling other young people how God had saved me. But little by little, pastors from other churches began to invite me to give my testimony. My first conference outside of London was in Manchester. When I was 15, I was very nervous. I didn't know if people would believe me, if my story would have any impact. But when I finished speaking, there were people crying, people coming up to tell me that my testimony had given them hope for their own struggles. It was then that I understood the purpose of all my suffering. God had not allowed me to go through that hell because he was evil or because he didn't love me. He had allowed it because he knew that my story could be used to heal others, to give hope to people who were going through desperate situations. At 17, I was already traveling all over England giving talks. My message was always the same. No matter how dark your situation, no matter how lost you feel, God has a plan for your life that includes your liberation and your purpose. I also talked a lot about forgiveness because I had discovered that it was the key to my total freedom. I had completely forgiven Mrs. Gray, Brenda, everyone who had harmed me. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from hatred and resentment. Forgiveness didn't mean that what they had done was okay, or that there shouldn't have been legal consequences. It meant that I had decided not to carry the weight of bitterness anymore, that I had put all my thirst for revenge in God's hands. At 18, I met the man who would become my husband. His name was Mark. He was a young Christian who attended one of my conferences in Birmingham. At the end of the talk, he came to greet me, and from the first moment I felt there was something special about him. Mark didn't see me as a victim who needed to be rescued. He saw me as a strong, brave woman with a clear purpose in life. That's what made me fall in love with him, that he could see beyond my traumatic past and value the woman I had become. We got married when I was 19, in a beautiful ceremony at the church where I had been baptized in London. Pastors Robert and Grace were the ones who gave me away at the altar because, for me, they were my true, spiritual parents. Mark and I had a dream, to form a large family, full of love, totally different from the dysfunctional family where I had grown up. We wanted to show that cycles of pain and violence can be broken with love and faith. But when we started trying to have children, we received devastating news. Doctors told me I was sterile, that the tortures I had suffered had irreversibly damaged my reproductive system. I remember leaving that doctor's office crying, feeling as if Mrs. Gray had stolen not only my childhood, but also my future as a mother. Mark comforted me, told me that we could adopt, that there were many ways to form a family. But I had faith that God, who had done so many miracles in my life, could also do this one. I prayed for months. I asked the Lord to give me the opportunity to be a mother, to raise children in an environment of love that I had never had. In January 1969, At 19 years old, I discovered I was pregnant. Doctors couldn't explain it. They said it was medically impossible. But I knew it was another miracle from God in my life. My first son, Daniel, was born in October 1969. When I held him in my arms for the first time, I cried with joy and gratitude. I whispered in his ear, "My son, you are proof that God turns pain into blessing, that He transforms wounds into miracles." 2 years later, Matthew was born in 1971. And 3 years after Matthew, Luke was born in 1974. 3 sons, 3 miracles, 3 gifts from God that showed me that my body, which had been used for evil for so long, could also be an instrument of life and love. I raised my children with much love, but also with clear boundaries and loving discipline. I never hit them, never yelled at them, never used fear as a method of education. I taught them that mistakes are corrected with patience, that conflicts are resolved with dialogue, that love is shown with actions, and not just with words. My children grew up knowing my story, but also seeing how that story had turned me into a stronger, more compassionate woman, more determined to do good. I never raised them as victims, but as victors, as children of a woman who had overcome the impossible. Throughout all these years, I continued giving talks all over England, and then in other European countries. My testimony became known, and I started being invited to speak at universities, hospitals, prisons, and rehabilitation centers. One of the most impactful experiences was when I was invited to speak at a women's prison in London. There I met women who had suffered abuses similar to mine in their childhood, and who, as a consequence, had taken paths of drugs, prostitution, and violence. When I finished telling my story, one of the inmates approached me crying and said, "Mrs. Sarah, if you could get through everything that happened to you, maybe I can also change my life." That woman converted to Christianity that night, and when she left prison 2 years later, she sought help at our church. Today she is a rehabilitated woman with a dignified job, reconciled with her children. She is one of the many lives that God has touched through my testimony. In 1985, when I was 35 years old, something happened that tested me like never before. I came face to face with Mrs. Gray. She had been released from prison after serving 7 years of her sentence, and by chance of fate, we met in a supermarket in London. At first, I didn't recognize her because she had aged a lot and looked very deteriorated. But when she turned around and looked at me, I immediately knew who she was. My first reaction was shock, then fear, and then a rage I hadn't felt in years. She also recognized me, and she froze, as if she had seen a ghost. She probably thought I was crazy, drug-addicted, or dead, that I had been destroyed forever by everything she had done to me. Instead, she found an elegant, well-dressed woman, obviously successful and at peace with herself. That confused and frightened her more than any revenge I could have planned. We stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. I felt that the whole store had disappeared, that it was just her and me, the tortured child and her torturer. 20 years later, finally she was the one who spoke first. With a trembling voice, she said, "Sarah, you are Sarah, aren't you?" I took a deep breath, sought strength in God, and replied, "Yes, Eleanor, I am Sarah. But I am not the broken child you left in that hospital years ago." She started to cry, something I had never seen her do during the 2 years I lived with her. Through tears, she said, "Sarah, I wanted to apologize. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what I did to you. I've been in therapy. I've been diagnosed with mental illnesses. but nothing justifies what I did to you. At that moment, my son, I had to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life. I could hold a grudge. I could humiliate her. I could make her suffer as she had made me suffer. I had every right in the world to do so. But I remembered everything I had learned about forgiveness. I remembered how it had freed me when I decided to forgive her for the first time. And I made the decision that completely healed me. I approached her, looked her in the eyes and said, "Eleanor, I forgive you. I forgave you many years ago, not for you, but for me. I'm not going to carry hatred in my heart for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that your forgiveness doesn't come from me. It comes from God. He is the one who can cleanse you completely from all that wickedness you had inside." She was so surprised that she stopped crying. She asked me, "How can you forgive me? How can you not hate me after everything I did to you?" I replied, "Because Jesus taught me that forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a decision. And because I've discovered that forgiveness frees me more than the person forgiven. I have decided to be free, Eleanor. I have decided that your wickedness will not determine the rest of my life." Before I left, I said, "Eleanor, I hope you find the peace I found. I hope you know God's love as I knew it. And I hope you use the rest of your life to do good, to make up for even a little bit all the evil you did." I never saw her again, but I learned from others that after our encounter she sought help in a church, that she converted to Christianity, that she spent her last years of life trying to do charity work. She died in 2010, and when I found out, I prayed for her soul. That encounter with Eleanor confirmed something I already knew. Forgiveness is the most powerful weapon we have against evil. It not only frees the forgiven, it mainly frees the forgiver. It freed me from carrying her poison in my heart for the rest of my life. In the late 1980s, when my children were already teenagers, Mark and I made a decision that would change our lives. We would move to France to open a Spanish-American church in Paris. We had been praying for a new stage in our ministry, and we felt that God was calling us to reach out to Latino immigrants who were arriving in Europe looking for a better life. The first few years in France were difficult. The language, the culture, the laws, everything was different. But little by little we established ties with the Hispanic community, and our church began to grow. In France, I also continued giving talks, now in 3 languages: Spanish, French, and Italian. My story became known throughout Europe, and I began to be invited to speak at international conferences on children's rights, domestic violence, and overcoming trauma. One of the most emotional moments of my life was when I was invited to speak at the United Nations in Geneva about the importance of protecting children from violence. Standing on that platform, speaking to representatives of countries from all over the world, was for me the definitive confirmation that God had used my pain for something much greater than I could imagine. In my speech at the UN, I said, "Honorable delegates, I am here not as a victim, but as a survivor. I am here to tell you that every child who suffers violence is a global emergency, that every abused child is a responsibility for all of us. But I am also here to tell you that no trauma is so deep that it cannot be healed with love, with faith, and with the right child protection policies." During the 1990s, I began to write my first book. I wanted to put my entire testimony in writing so that it could continue to impact lives even after my death. The book was called From Hell to Heaven, A Story of Miracles and Forgiveness. The book became a bestseller in England and was translated into 12 languages. I received letters from people all over the world telling me how my story had given them hope, how they had decided to forgive their aggressors, how they had found strength to report situations of abuse. One of the letters that most impacted me was from a German woman named Ingrid, who had suffered similar abuses from her stepfather during her childhood. She wrote to me, "Mrs. Sarah, for 40 years I have carried hatred and bitterness. I read your book and understood that forgiveness is not for the aggressors. It is for us victims. Today I forgave my stepfather, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve to be free." In the year 2000, when I turned 50, Mark and I made another important decision: to return to England. Our children were already adults. They had formed their own families, and we felt that God was calling us to a new stage of our ministry in our homeland. We established our base in London, but continued traveling throughout Europe giving talks. We also opened a help center for victims of domestic violence and child abuse, where we offered free therapy, legal advice, and above all, hope and love. During these years, I also dedicated myself to writing more books. The second was called The Power of Forgiveness: How to Free Your Heart from the Past. The third was Healing Scars: Transforming Pain into Purpose. Each book carried the same central message: that no matter how deep the pain, there is always hope for healing and transformation. One of the most moving experiences of these years was when I was invited to speak at a conference for therapists, specializing in child trauma. After my talk, a psychologist approached me crying and said, "Mrs. Sarah, I have been working with traumatized children for 20 years, and sometimes I lose hope. To see what you achieved, to see what you became, gives me strength to continue believing that all my little patients can heal completely." In 2005, when I was 55 years old, I received news that filled me with indescribable joy. My first grandchild had been born. Daniel, my eldest son, had made me a grandmother of a beautiful girl named Grace, in honor of the pastor who had raised me. Holding that baby in my arms was one of the most emotional moments of my life. I thought of all the moments during my captivity when I believed I would never have a normal life, never have a family, never know happiness. And there I was, grandmother of a precious girl with a life full of purpose and meaning. I whispered in my granddaughter's ear, "My dear Grace, you will grow up in a world of love, in a family where you will never know violence, where you will always be protected and valued. Your grandmother made sure to break the chains of the past so that you can fly freely." During the 2000s, I also began to work more closely with the English authorities in creating protocols for child protection. My experience as a victim, combined with my years of working with other survivors, had given me a unique perspective on what works and what doesn't work in child protection. I participated in drafting new laws that required health and education professionals to report suspected cases of abuse. I also helped develop training programs for police and social workers on how to interview child victims without re-traumatizing them. One of the things I am most proud of in this work is that we managed to implement a protocol where child abuse victims are interviewed by trained specialists in safe and welcoming environments to avoid them having to repeat their traumatic story multiple times before different authorities. In 2008, exactly 50 years after my rescue, I was invited to give a special conference in London at the same hospital where I had been treated after being freed. It was a very emotional event because some of the doctors and nurses who had cared for me in 1962 still worked there and came to hear me. Dr. Thompson, who was already retired but had been the doctor who treated me when I was 12, approached me after the conference with tears in his eyes and said, "Sarah, when I first saw you, I thought we had arrived too late, that the damage was irreversible. To see the woman you have become, to see all the good you have done in the world, is confirmation that miracles exist. During that same visit to London, I did something I had been postponing for years. I visited the house where I had been tortured. The mansion was still there, but now it was owned by another family. I stood in front of the entrance gate, and instead of feeling pain or bitterness, I felt deep gratitude. I said aloud, "Thank you, my God, for taking me out of this place. Thank you for turning this place of pain into the starting point of my life's purpose. Thank you for showing me that no hell is permanent when you are with us." Mark, who was with me, hugged me and said, "My love, this place no longer has power over you. You are completely free." In 2010, when I turned 60, Mark and I decided to write a book together about how to build strong marriages after trauma. It was called Healing Love, Building Solid Relationships on Foundations of Faith. We wanted to show that abuse victims can indeed have healthy relationships, can trust again, can love, and be loved fully. In that book, Mark wrote a chapter about what it means to love a woman who has been traumatized. He said, "Loving Sarah didn't mean trying to fix her or make her forget her past. It meant loving her completely, with her wounds and her strengths, with her nightmares and her dreams. It meant being patient when fear appeared without reason, being understanding when she needed space, being strong when she felt vulnerable." During these years, I also had the blessing of meeting many other trauma survivors who had become activists and speakers. We formed a kind of informal network of women who used our stories to bring about positive changes in the world. One of these women was Maria, a Mexican woman who had survived human trafficking and was now fighting modern slavery. Another was Jane, an American woman who had escaped a religious cult and now helped other victims of psychological manipulation. Together, we organized several international events where we shared our stories and trained aid professionals. We called ourselves the Warriors of Hope because we had decided to turn our pain into power, our wounds into weapons against injustice. In 2012, at 62 years old, something unexpected happened to me. I started losing my voice. Doctors told me that after decades of giving conferences, my vocal cords were very worn out. They recommended that I drastically reduce my public presentations. At first, I felt devastated. Speaking in public had been my life's mission for over 40 years. It was the main way I felt I honored all my suffering. But Mark helped me to see this new stage as an opportunity, not a limitation. "My love," he said, "perhaps it's time for you to focus more on writing, on training other speakers, on creating content that can impact future generations, even when we are no longer here." So for the next few years, I dedicated myself more to writing and mentoring young people who wanted to pursue activism and social work. We opened a scholarship program at our help center, where we trained trauma survivors to become counselors and activists. One of my most outstanding students was Emily, a young woman who had been a victim of sexual abuse by her uncle, and who came to us completely broken, without hope. We worked with her for 2 years, and not only did she heal completely, but she became one of the most effective social workers I have ever known. Emily once told me, "Mrs. Sarah, you taught me that my pain didn't have to be the end of my story, but the beginning of my purpose. Now every life I help to heal is a way of honoring my own healing." In 2015, when I was 65 years old, Mark started showing the first signs of dementia. It was devastating for me because he had been my companion, my support, my best friend for over 40 years. To see how he slowly lost his memory, forgot our history together, was one of the deepest pains I have ever experienced. But even in that difficult situation, I found reasons for gratitude. Caring for Mark during his last years taught me a kind of love I didn't know. The love that gives without expecting anything in return. The love that serves without being reciprocated. The love that finds joy in small moments of connection. Mark died in my arms in January 2018, after 3 years of battling dementia. His last coherent words were, "Sarah, thank you for loving me despite everything. See you in heaven." His death left me devastated, but also filled me with a deep peace. We had had 49 years of beautiful marriage. We had raised 3 wonderful children. We had impacted thousands of lives together. We had nothing to regret. After the funeral, my children suggested that I go live with one of them, but I decided to maintain my independence. At 68 years old, I felt strong and capable of taking care of myself. Besides, I still had work to do. During the last years of my life, I have been working on my most ambitious project, an international foundation that bears my name and is exclusively dedicated to the prevention of child abuse and the rehabilitation of victims. The Sarah Evans Hope Foundation now operates in 12 countries, has helped more than 10,000 child abuse victims, and has trained thousands of professionals in the detection and treatment of child trauma. One of the programs I am most proud of is Homes of Hope, which are residential centers for children who have been rescued from severe abuse situations. In these centers, children receive not only medical and psychological care, but also unconditional love, quality education, and the opportunity to develop their unique talents. Every time I visit one of these homes and see the children laughing, playing, studying, trusting adults again, I think of the 12-year-old girl I was, chained on those stairs, asking God to free her. That girl could never have imagined that. Her pain would become the salvation of so many other children. In 2020, when I was 70 years old, I received news that filled me with emotion. I had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for my work in children's rights. Although I didn't win, the simple fact of having been considered was a confirmation that my life had been worthwhile. During the nomination ceremony in Oslo, I had the opportunity to speak to an international audience. I said, "Honorable Committee, members, I am here not as a heroine, but as living proof that God can bring beauty from ashes, can turn pain into purpose, can transform victims into victors. Also, during 2020, the year of the pandemic, I had to adapt to new technologies to continue sharing my message. My grandchildren taught me how to use Zoom and other digital platforms, and so I was able to continue giving virtual conferences to people all over the world. It was fascinating to discover that, through technology, I could reach audiences I would never have been able to reach physically. I gave lectures for universities in Japan, for aid organizations in Africa, for rehabilitation centers in Latin America. One of the most emotional virtual conferences was for a group of women in Afghanistan who had suffered abuse under the Taliban regime. Although the circumstances were different, the pain was the same, and I was able to share with them the message that no trauma is permanent when we find our purpose in love and service to others. In 2021, I published my last book, Letters to My Granddaughter, Life Lessons from a Survivor. These were letters I had been writing to my granddaughter Grace, where I shared everything I had learned in my 71 years of life. In one of those letters I wrote, "My dearest Grace, when you are older and read these letters, I want you to know that your grandmother was not defined by the terrible things that happened to her, but by the decisions she made after they happened. You too have that power, the power to decide who you will be, no matter what happens to you in life." Last year in 2022, I turned 72. my children organized a huge party where they invited all the people whose lives I had impacted over the years. Trauma survivors from all over Europe came, social workers who had been trained in our programs, politicians who had implemented laws based on our recommendations. But what moved me most were the videos sent by children from our homes of hope. An 8-year-old boy from our home in London told me, "Mrs. Sarah, thank you for teaching us that children who have suffered a lot are not broken forever, that they can be happy again." A 10-year-old girl from our home in Manchester sang me a song she had composed about hope. The lyrics said, "Even if it rains in my heart, the sun shines after the pain, because there is a lady who taught me that miracles really exist." Today, my son, at 74 years old, I can say with absolute certainty that my life has been a continuous miracle. Not only the miracle of having survived those tortures, but the miracle of having found purpose in pain, of having turned wounds into strengths, of having transformed bitterness into love. I look back and see every stage of my life as part of a perfect divine plan. My childhood of poverty taught me to value simple things. My time of suffering taught me that I can survive anything. My rescue taught me that God hears our desperate prayers. My time with Pastors Robert and Grace taught me what unconditional love is. My marriage to Mark taught me that it is possible to trust again after trauma. My children taught me that cycles of pain can be broken. My activism taught me that our pain can be an instrument of salvation for others. Every day I wake up is a gift. Every story of healing and transformation I hear is a confirmation that everything I went through was worth it. I am a 74-year-old woman who has lived more than many people live in 100 years, who has loved deeply, who has been deeply loved, who has made a real difference in the world. If I could speak to the 12-year-old girl who was hanging from those stairs, I would tell her, "Don't give up, little one. What you are experiencing is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your purpose. God has plans for you that are more beautiful than you can imagine. You will know true love. You will form a beautiful family. You will impact thousands of lives. You will be happy in a way you cannot even dream of now." And to you, who have had the patience to listen to my story until the end, I want to tell you this. No matter what you have lived, what you are living now, what difficulties you face in the future, you have within you the power to transform any pain into purpose, any wound into strength, any tragedy into testimony. Forgiveness is possible, son. Healing is possible. Transformation is possible. Miracles are possible. I am living proof that God can take the most broken pieces of a life and create something beautiful, something meaningful, something worthwhile with them. As long as I have breath in my lungs, I will continue to share this message of hope. And when I am no longer here, I trust that the thousands of lives we have touched will continue to spread this message of love, forgiveness, and transformation throughout the world. Because the truth is this, my son, no pain is wasted when we place it in God's hands. No suffering is in vain when we decide to use it to heal others. No life is lost as long as it has the ability to give hope to someone else. This has been my story. A story of horror that turned into hope, of pain that transformed into purpose, of a victim who decided to become victorious. And if I could do it, you can too. If I could heal, you can too. If I could forgive, you can too. If I could be happy after so much suffering, you can too. May God bless you, son. May you find in my story the strength you need to write your own. A story of triumph, of love, of forgiveness, of hope that never ends. That is my prayer for you, And that is my legacy to the world, that they may know that there is always, always hope.